This year's ballot will feature 11 state questions. The one with the most impact in the business community is State Question 744. This question would require state common education appropriations to equal per pupil expenditure spent in the surrounding states, although there's nothing in the provision requiring the money to be spent in the classroom. This is a four-part question. So, what is your position on State Question 744? As governor, what would you do if it passes? What would you do if it fails? And what adjective do you think best describes this question? And there'll be a chapter test on it later, too.
Well, I think we've all been pretty clear, those of us that are running for most of the major offices, that 744 is not the right answer for funding education. I'm opposed to it. And I say that because I want it to be clear that I have always said that I am opposed to it. We have, if it passes, if 744 passes, all the more reason to talk about some of the budget reform efforts that I have talked about. State services will be devastated. Oklahoma, fortunately, is a state that requires a balanced budget, and we must continue to be able to make sure that Oklahoma lives within its means. 744 would increase over a 3-year time period, would increase the amount of money that's required to go to education. When we know this next year's fiscal year, we're going to have maybe as much as $1 billion shortfall or less revenue to spend than this year, it would only complicate the ability to fund roads, corrections, mental health issues, plus higher education and some of the early childhood programs that have set Oklahoma apart. To be able to meet that requirement, I believe every legislator needs to be involved in the budget process, just like the governor needs to be hands-on in that process. Beginning and trying to focus on looking at each agency line by line is going to require us to no longer look at what services we can continue to provide, but look at the constituencies and see where there's similarities so we can make them match. If 744 fails, I think the state still has an obligation to look at what we can do to make sure that we are getting the right resources. I think people really do believe that there needs to be some focus on how we fund education and how we make sure that our students are getting the right kind of teaching, that there's accountability for how we spend the money. I think they were well-intentioned. I think this is the wrong plan.
Well, I am not supporting State Question 744, and the one word I would think about as it relates to the funding in the legislation is just irresponsible. It would be devastating for Oklahoma's budget, as it has been said through many different articles and debate. 744 requires that Oklahoma spends the regional average compared to other states on education. There's no funding source, and there's actually no reform that will be mandated through the state question itself. So there's no promise that education really will be improved. And so I'm not supporting it. It's estimated it would cost the state of Oklahoma up to $850 million. By the time it's implemented, that would be taken away from other essential governmental services at a time when we had a $1.2 billion shortfall just this past year. We may experience a $600 to $800 million shortfall this coming year. And so there's two options of funding that. Either you raise taxes, which I won't do, or you further cut government spending. Now, I am for making government smaller, smarter, more efficient, and that's part of my platform. But it would require us to look at state government and possibly have to cut 30 to 35% from roads and bridges, from corrections, from law enforcement, from mental health services, senior nutrition programs, and that would be devastating to our state services and certainly our state budget. But no matter whether it passes or not, part of my plan is that as governor, I think we should have a total look at state services from top to bottom. We have some state agencies that were created 30, 40, 50 years ago. We need to look at the mission of government itself to make sure it's relevant, it's efficient, it's effective. I saw a legislative study that said that we had over 500 different agency boards and commissions in the state of Oklahoma. Kansas has around 130, Arkansas has around 190, and we have 500. And that's money from our pockets as taxpayers, money as businesses that we pay in to fund government itself. So no matter whether it passes or not, as governor, I'm going to look at government itself, how we can eliminate waste, duplication, how we can make sure that our money is being spent wisely, how we can right-size state government, and that will be part of my plan and part of my goal.
Staying with the issue of education, Oklahoma is known to have one of the best pre-K programs in the nation, a stellar career tech system, and a premier higher education institutions. However, we have one of the highest remediation rates in the nation for those entering college. There seems to be a disconnect with our K through 12 system. What would be your top priority for reforming Oklahoma's common education system?
Well, let me just make a comment on some of the facts that you just stated. First of all, it's unacceptable that we have such a high remediation rate from our students that are graduating from high school, entering into their college. They should be well prepared and have all the knowledge that they need when they graduate to high school to be prepared to step up into whether it's a career tech or whether it is college itself. We do have, I think, one of the best early childhood education programs in the nation. I believe we have one of the best career tech systems in the nation, and certainly we're very proud of our higher education institutions in our state. But how do we improve education? Well, first of all, we get money into the classroom, get it out of the administrative overhead costs, look at creating more efficiencies in government. It goes back to my plan, once again, of right-sizing government, getting money into the classroom where it belongs so that we can improve education itself. And I am very proud that the legislature passed what's called pay for performance so that we can make sure that we hire and reward effective teachers that are doing the job. And that's a new piece of legislation that I will make sure is fully implemented and is fairly implemented for our teachers that are in the workforce so that we reward the teachers that are doing a good job. I think we have to have more local control, more parental involvement in our school system. And another thing that I think is very important in education is that we need to make sure that our children can read at grade appropriate level. There are many studies that show that a child, the first through the third grade, learns to read. But the fourth grade on, a child reads to learn. And if they can't read at grade appropriate level, they can't learn the math and the science and the social studies and the other things that they need to be able to graduate from high school prepared to enter into college so we can reduce that remediation rate.
Sometimes you need to break down the statistic is horrible on remediation. But if you break it down to the different kinds of colleges and universities we have, about 3.3% of remediation occurs at our research institutions. It's a little over 17% at the regional universities. And then it's about 79% remediation occurs at our community colleges. And you have to realize our community colleges has a much more open enrollment, and it's where so many more adults go back into the classroom, sometimes after years or decades maybe, from when they finished high school. So when we look at where those numbers are, sometimes we see that our research institutions really are doing a good job. Those are where most of the students are the traditional finishing high school and going straight into college. We need to also realize that when you look at the background of the students that are needing remediation, those who have taken a college preparatory curriculum are the ones who are least likely to end up in remediation. What this shows us is that the ACE initiative, the Achieving Classroom Excellence initiative that was passed several years ago, will have an impact because that's a curriculum, that's a requirement that made the default curriculum in our high schools one that would be preparation for college. That bill is in effect right now, and I think that this year are the sophomores who began that curriculum. Their graduation will be in 2013, so we will see if those remediation rates will begin to improve. The one thing that I think has to be a priority is making sure that we put highly qualified teachers in our classrooms. Oklahoma has some of the best standards in the country. We consistently rate among the top 5 or at least the top 10, and I think it's the top 5 in the way that we prepare our next generation of educators. We prepare them extremely well, and then we frequently lose them, not always because of they're getting a job, but sometimes a spouse maybe get a better job in another state, but we lose those teachers that we prepare in our classrooms. We need to make sure that we are giving them the flexibility to do the job that they have trained to do, that they are the ones who have been prepared to teach the current generation, which learns a lot differently than I learned and learned a lot differently than most of us in this room. We must be sure that we put those resources, whether they are smart boards, the technology that keeps these students engaged when they're not in school, we need to be able to use those tools in the learning environment as well. When we do that, we will not only see remediation rates go down, but we will see high school dropout rates go down and college graduation rates rise.
In order to help balance the state budget, the legislature last session passed a 2-year moratorium on many of the state's business incentives, many of which are targeted at enhancing economic development. What are your views on business incentives as a method for stimulating economic growth?
I'm a supporter of the incentives that we have seen have the most success, the Quality Jobs Program, and I think the 21st Century Investment Act. Some of the changes that have been made even over the last 3 or 4 years to make sure that Oklahoma's incentives are matched with the kinds of jobs that Oklahoma wants to bring to our state. But every incentive that is on our books, whether it is a tax credit, a tax incentive, a tax exemption, needs to have review, and it doesn't need to be a once-in-a-lifetime review. It needs to be regularly reviewed. I believe in performance measures or evaluations that tell us whether or not these incentives are actually working. If they are not providing jobs that come to our state and stay in our state, then we should eliminate them. But the incentives that are working are proving that they are they're doing the job they're intended to do. The new engineering jobs that have been brought into the Oklahoma City area by Boeing are an example of the incentives that the city and the state were able to put together, helped make those jobs come to Oklahoma as opposed to staying in California. So we need to make sure that we have the right kind of measures, the right kind of evaluations, and we need to look at those that are successful in helping grow the economy by creating jobs.
Well, I do think that we do need incentives to be competitive with other states when it makes sense and it actually creates jobs and brings investment, either helping businesses to expand or actually recruiting new businesses to the state. But we also need to have a look at what incentives do work and what incentives don't work. And if they're not working, then we need to get rid of them. And that's why I have advocated looking at having a governor's task force that would look at our rules, our regulations, and our tax structure to see what we do that actually retains jobs and creates jobs, but to also get rid of the impediments that would keep us from growing jobs in our state. And when I talk about that, I talk about our tax structure, whether it is looking at our taxes, whether it's looking at our high cost of workers' compensation, whether it's needing more tort reform in the state of Oklahoma, removing impediments that makes us less competitive as a state. We have had incentives that have been good to attract jobs, the engineering tax credit for our aerospace industry. We have over 500 different aerospace-related companies in the state of Oklahoma that creates jobs, and the average job in the aerospace industry brings in about $55,000 a year is what it pays, so it's a good paying job. We've had some incentives for the wind energy sector. I've been out and visited a lot of the wind companies, and we know they create big investment in our state, which not only brings jobs into the local communities, but they also lease property and put money into property taxes, which goes back to education, back into our economy. So having a thorough review of what works, what doesn't work, I think is just wise policy. And then also doing a cost versus a benefit. There's no reason to have an incentive on the books if it's not going to benefit the state of Oklahoma and maybe cost us more than what it's worth. So I think there are times that we need to be competitive as a state, and we need to see what the other states are doing where we can be more competitive, and that's what I would support.
A few years ago, Oklahoma created what is called the Opportunity Fund, which would allow the governor to make an impact on economic development projects by providing a financial incentive encouraging businesses to move to Oklahoma. This concept has been embraced by other states, including Texas and Arkansas. Oklahoma was never fully funded at their particular plan, therefore never fully implemented. Do you think Oklahoma needs to continue a closing fund like this? And if so, what are your ideas on how to fund it?
Well, we do have an opportunity, I believe, with a governor's closing fund when an opportunity comes along to be able to put Oklahoma in a better position in competition with other states. I know Governor Rick Perry has been very aggressive with his opportunity fund, his closing fund. And many times you have to make a quick decision when you're competing and you're down to the final wire and you got two different states that are competing against each other. And maybe that last little tweak and what the opportunity might be to come to your state. So I think it's important to have that. It's a shame that Oklahoma hasn't been able to implement that. But the question is, how do you fund that? And that goes back to my original Fallin plan, and that is to focus on jobs, the economy, and creating the very best business environment possible to send a signal that we're ready and open for business. And to me, how you grow the economy is that you focus on keeping our taxes low, reducing the tax burden on individuals and families, once again, addressing the high cost of workers' compensation. I will tell you that I was visiting with a business just recently that told me that their workers' compensation premium costs in our state went up 72% in 1 year. You talk about something that will kill jobs and kill business expansion, is the high cost of workers' compensation. So those are some of the things I think we need to look at, is creating that very best business environment, improving the education itself, and making sure that government is right sized so that businesses can keep more of their money, individuals can keep more of their money. And once again, of course, I do support a closing fund for a governor, because I believe the governor should be the person that can kind of help open the doors and close the deal, be the top business recruiter and chief possible for the state. And I think that would send a message that Oklahoma is ready and open for business.
Well, I certainly do support the Opportunity Fund. And one of the areas that I think has been of some concern is maybe it's not as explained in the Oklahoma legislature as it could be. It does not need to be perceived in such a way that that the tension between the legislature prevents funding it if they think the governor's involved. So I believe that the Opportunity Fund needs to exist. It needs to be a quick close. It needs to have a vetting process, I believe, from non-elected officials, but those that are experienced in finance from the business community, that give us an idea of which of the, because I can promise you, you get a lot of applications, and you get a lot more applications than you have money to be able to support. So we need a vetting process so that the best projects, the ones with the best potential, the ones that best fit the state of Oklahoma, are the ones that have a chance to reach into the closing fund. In terms of being able to fund it, it needs to be in such a way that there is no tension between the legislature, so that they have confidence in what the money is going to go to. That's why it needs to be not political. I believe in a long term that we try to find a way to perhaps find a regular funding source, but I can't tell you that right now, because when we know that we're already $1 billion less to spend next year than this current fiscal year, and if the passage of 744 could add additional money on top of that, I can't tell you where that money is going to come for the Opportunity Fund right now. But we know that long term, we need to be able to put money into that fund. We need to be able to continue to put money. It needs to be replenished whenever the money has been spent. Perhaps there is a way to be creative that allows those companies that are using it to be able, as they begin to be successful, to also contribute back to that fund, so that you have that recurring funding opportunity, and let them have a little buy-in and pay it forward themselves.
The past 2 years, the state has seen a significant decline in revenue, and legislative leaders have exhausted almost all of the state's one-time funds. Given this fiscal reality, how do you plan to balance the budget, which is constitutionally demanded? If your plan includes agency consolidation in an effort to make government more efficient, which agencies would you target?
I think everybody, every member of the legislature needs to be involved in the legislative process. The legislature is not required to pass new laws, but we are required to pass a balanced budget. This session requires us to do redistricting, reapportionment. It has to be done because it's every 10 years. The next focus should be on the budget. Having been the subcommittee chair of a budget committee for 6 years, a vice chair 2 years, serving 10 out of 12 years on the budget committee, I believe we make better decisions when more legislators are involved in the process. It has been extremely difficult in the last 2 years, and I give a great deal of credit to the leaders in the House and the Senate and the governor's negotiator for trying to put together and cobbling together a budget the last 2 years. But we know that the last of the stimulus money is gone. We know that the last of the rainy day fund is gone, except for about $100 million that was set aside to be able to be used this year. We know that we're not going to have any additional new revenue, and I don't see our economy improving fast enough to make up for that almost $1 billion that we know is going to be less. If every legislator can be involved in the process, then I believe we have the chance to look in depth at every agency, line by line, and be able to figure out which programs and services are not the core mission of those agencies. When we have that type of intensive look, then you have a chance to be able to see if there are similar programs existing in other agencies and other departments. And when that exists, that's when you have to move them together under this type of a budget situation that we are in. It is likely that the state revenues that we have for next year will be about equivalent to what we had in 2005, and I can guarantee you that the expenses of all of our agencies have gone up. So we know that we are going to have to downsize. We know that we're going to have to cut back even further. I'm not going into this with a preconceived idea as to which agencies need to be consolidated, which boards of commissions need to be meshed together. There are some constitutional issues that I do think prohibit some that may look like obvious matches, but they really can't be because of some constitutional issues. Everybody is fair game right now. Every program is fair game. Every service is fair game for being trimmed, cut back, or totally eliminated.
Well, thank goodness we do have a constitutional amendment that we do have to balance the budget, unlike Washington. And thank goodness we know that you can't borrow, tax, and spend your way to prosperity like some in Washington are trying to do to balance the budget there. But, I've talked about a lot on this campaign trail that my focus as governor is going to be to get our economy back on track, to focus on jobs and job creation, to removing impediments to doing business, to right-size state government itself, as I've already mentioned, and to go line by line in the budget to see what is necessary, what's not necessary. I think the legislature, when it first comes back into session, should focus on our top spending priorities of the state, whether it is education, transportation, law enforcement, corrections, healthcare services, our essential governmental services, because we are going to have another budget shortfall this coming year. We don't have the stimulus money. We don't have as much in the rainy day fund as we did have, and it will be a much tighter year. So focusing on the priorities in spending and state government, making government efficient, more effective, eliminating waste and duplication. One particular governmental service you asked me to mention would be to look at how can we make Oklahoma more business friendly. I've heard a lot of the business owners, as I've traveled across the state, tell me that when they go to start up a business, they may have to go to 3 or 4 different places to get a license or a permit. That's a waste of time, and it's frustrating. And so rather than having to go to the tax commission, the health department, the water resources board, corporation commission, wherever it might be, why can't we just have a one-stop shop place to go get licenses and permits? I mean, we've got the internet now to where you can buy anything, you can put information in, you can order things, get information you need. It just seems to make sense to me that we can make government itself more efficient. We can help make Oklahoma more business friendly. And so that's some of the ideas that I have, is focusing on jobs, economy, removing impediments to business, right-sizing government. And frankly, let me just close with one last thing, because this is something that I've had experience with in Washington, is that many times Washington tries to pass unfunded mandates down to our state. And with President Obama's new health care bill, over the next 10 years, it's going to pass unfunded mandates onto our state, which will cause the state of Oklahoma to have to spend an extra $500 million in the expansion of Medicaid at a time when we have a budget shortfall and at a time when we don't have that extra money. And so just standing up to Washington when they try to pass unfunded mandates on down to our state is another way I think would help balance the budget.
We can all agree we need to attract new business to our state and help businesses expand here and create new jobs. And we've kind of already touched on this. As governor, what is one new idea you plan to execute during your first term in office to help grow and diversify Oklahoma's economy?
Well, to be a governor that will sign true workers' compensation reform. I think that's not a new idea. It's actually an old problem that we've had in the state of Oklahoma, is the high cost of workers' compensation. I was visiting with several business people. I'll just tell you a couple of stories as I've traveled across the state. I was up in Alva, Oklahoma at a bread manufacturing company, and this was last year in the midst of when the economy was down and people were losing jobs. And this man told me that he was going to add a new piece of equipment to his bread manufacturing company and add about 10 new jobs. But he told me that his workers' compensation rates doubled. And so he said, instead of hiring the 10 new people that I was going to hire, and instead of buying that new piece of equipment, he said, I've got to pay my new premium increase in workers' compensation. I told you about the lady who told me that she had a servicing company in Oklahoma, and her premium costs went up 72% this past year. In fact, she said she's leasing employees, which, that's another issue. I visited with a businessman who had a business here in Oklahoma and one in Texas, the same exact company doing the same exact things, just 2 different states, 2 different workers' compensation systems. And he told me that his workers' compensation costs in Oklahoma was about 24% of his expenses of doing business in our state, but in the state of Texas, it was 4%. And he said, Mary, because I love Oklahoma, I raised my family here, I built a business here, it's been good to us, I love living here. But he said, from a financial standpoint, as a business person, it would make more sense for me to close my business in Oklahoma and move it to Texas. So one very specific thing I think we can do would be to address an age-old problem, and that is some of the costs of doing business in the state of Oklahoma, and how can we make Oklahoma more business-friendly?
I don't think there's any magic bullet. I think I've been in the legislature long enough to see ideas that have come, and many of you have seen them, where we were told this is going to save this area, or this is going to provide additional funding and save another area. But I do believe that we have to listen to what our business leaders have to say. And I can tell you that in the first 6 months that I have a chance to serve as your governor, my intention is to visit with the top 5 or 6 leading private employers in the state of Oklahoma and visit with them about their issues regarding workforce, regarding their workers' comp, regarding their expenses, regarding whether or not what they have from the state of Oklahoma, whether we're a help or a hindrance. I hear it from small businesses all the time, as we have had town meetings around the state last year and listened to what our small business owners had to say. But our larger employers, which tend to be near our larger metropolitan areas, you are the ones who are really keeping things going right now. We need to be able to figure out how to help you keep the jobs that we already have in this state. Sustaining current employment is a real critical priority for us, because if we begin to lose the jobs, if you have to lay people off, then those are fewer dollars that are turning over in our local communities, and it does not help our economic growth. It is counterproductive for us to have businesses have to lay people off. The opportunity to try to continue to figure out how to bring capital to this state. We know that there are investors that have money around the country that are looking for states that they believe are investing in themselves, that they believe have a solid business climate, that are moving in the right direction. And I want Oklahoma to be that kind of state where that money can come in. We have some good investment programs right now that help us through OCAST and I2E, and some seed capital that is there for some really creative ventures. But because of some of the additional assessments that have been having to be paid to Washington, we have banks now. I've served on a bank board for over 12 years, and the assessments now, the special assessments, are now over 3 times what used to be paid. Local money that could be in our local banks available for businesses or individuals for loans is now being sent to Washington, D.C. So we have to find other capital to bring to Oklahoma. That's my goal as your governor.
Oklahoma's Economic Development Generating Excellence Fund, commonly referred to as the EDGE Fund, is designed to bolster Oklahoma's long-term economic growth by investing the earnings from the EDGE endowment to support research and the transfer of innovation and technology to the private sector, therefore generating high-paying jobs and helping to stimulate the economy. Do you support the continuation and protection of this fund? And if so, how do you plan to properly fund this effort?
I think the goal was to eventually get up to like $1 billion in an endowment, and that would be so phenomenal for the state of Oklahoma. We have not thought in terms very often in our history of creating a state fund and allowing us the opportunity to live off the interest. That is, until we started with the Tobacco Trust after the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. I absolutely support the EDGE Fund. I had an opportunity to serve on one of the committees as it was being developed, the Higher Education Committee, and talking about what we could do, and certainly higher education is such a perfect partner for many of the opportunities that we believe creating this research institution, the state of Oklahoma being known in such a way that we now have more research scientists that are world-class coming to Oklahoma because of the investments that have been made. The EDGE Fund would give us that opportunity to say that this is a continuing step. We think that the EDGE Fund has to have, I think, a greater priority in many ways than perhaps some of the other funds that may get talked about in a few minutes, because this is economic development. It is a step towards saying education is important. It is a step towards saying that when we have an opportunity to invest in a business that's coming to Oklahoma, then we believe that it's going to have a long-term commitment, and that long-term return on the investment gives us a chance to say to our children who are graduating from high school and college that we're going to have the high-paying jobs that will let you choose to stay in the state of Oklahoma, not make you think you have to go somewhere else. Absolutely support it. Can tell you with this year's budget, I don't know where the money's going to come from, but as we begin to grow the economy where we can begin to make deposits into our rainy day fund, I think the chance to be able to say, let's take some of that growth revenue and be able to make an annual commitment to the EDGE endowment so that you who are investing in Oklahoma will know the state has the same commitment.
I absolutely support the EDGE fund. I think it was a great idea, especially as it relates to research and development jobs. You know, I'd love to see an article someday about the state of Oklahoma when we do the things I've been talking about that would say Oklahoma is the state for entrepreneurs. It's a state where entrepreneurs can have an idea. There are different resources within that state, such as the EDGE program, that helps new businesses grow and flourish and new innovative ideas. And EDGE Fund has certainly been one of those funds that we have that can help create those kind of jobs. You know, I'm sitting here thinking about some of the research I've seen going on in Oklahoma and some of the great potential that I see on the horizon for job creation and putting Oklahoma on the map. We have a wonderful place up in Ponca City called the University Multispectral Lab, which is a research arm with OSU in a partnership that is actually working to create more unmanned aerial vehicles that's being used in Afghanistan and Pakistan and different areas, but being researched right in Oklahoma with help of OSU and the help of that multispectral lab. Or you think about the Noble Foundation down in Ardmore where they're doing biofuel research. Certainly energy is one of our top industries in our state, and I think we got a lot of room for expansion to even put Oklahoma further on the map as it relates to energy production, energy research. We certainly can use the EDGE fund for things like that. I mentioned about the aerospace industry. You know, I've had the opportunity to serve on the Armed Forces Committee in Washington. I've worked a lot with the defense industry. I've served on the aviation committee also in Washington, and I see great potential as it relates to our maintenance and repair facilities, whether it's at Tinker, whether it's at American Airlines, whether it's our aerospace company, with defense contracting, with the research, with the products and services we're developing in that particular industry. I mean, I think it's just unlimited what we can do, and certainly the EDGE Fund is one of those funds that's available to the state of Oklahoma. As far as a funding source, it goes back to that same old issue that we've been talking about up here, and that is making government smaller, smarter, more efficient, not having waste, not having duplication, growing the economy, and doing the things that will generate the revenue from our economy so we can fund EDGE, Opportunity Fund, education, law enforcement, corrections, and all those important priorities for the state.
In 2009, lawsuit reform legislation was passed that called for the creation of a medical liability indemnity fund in an effort to end doctors leaving Oklahoma because of high medical malpractice rates. The estimated cost of such a fund is $2 million. Do you support the funding of this indemnity fund? And if so, how do you propose Oklahoma find the money for it?
It's always that money question, isn't it? I tell you, you've been asking that every time. Well, and I think I've already explained my position on that, but I absolutely do support it. I think it's one of the essential portions, pieces of real lawsuit reform for the state of Oklahoma, and I think the legislature was wise to try to set up that fund, but now we do have to fund it itself. But during this campaign and as a member of Congress, especially with all the debate about health care reform and how do we lower health care costs and create better access to care, I have visited with many physicians throughout our state and many hospitals throughout our state. And what I hear from our physicians is, Mary, you've got to do something about medical malpractice costs in the state of Oklahoma. As you mentioned, we do have many physicians that either quit practicing or they do leave the state of Oklahoma because of that higher cost, and that's what the legislature was trying to address through its tort reform and the indemnity fund itself. But from what I hear from our physicians and hospitals is that many times they have to practice defensive medicine. In other words, they have to order duplicate tests because they're worried about getting sued because with their patients. And so I think tort reform, medical practice reform is an essential component of any type of making Oklahoma more business friendly to not only retaining doctors that are here, but also attracting new business to our state. And I will tell you that when President Obama's health care bill passed, that was one of the core ingredients that I believe that could have lowered health care costs that was missing There was no tort reform in that legislation. And so I think we have to continue to do everything we can to create a fair system to take care of those that are either injured or have some reason for a legal challenge, but also have reasonable costs within the system itself.
I do support the fund, and I thought it was a really creative aspect of the bill that was passed in 2009, not one that had come up previously in other discussions that I knew had gone on. And I believe that the legislation in 2009 has placed caps on pain and suffering, the damages that do get paid in that area. And this indemnity fund can be used if for some reason that the amount of award from a court would actually exceed what that cap is. Rather than a business pay it, it could come out of this fund. We need to pay it. I know that the state Senate, I'm president of the Senate, I know from discussions last year that the Senate thought it was going to be funded. I don't know what happened at the end of session to not get the initial investment in there, but I know that it's something that legislative leaders believe in, and we need to help get funded. If the beginning estimate is $2 million, we need to at least make a step toward that so that we can say to those that are engaged in these kinds of lawsuits that the state of Oklahoma is stepping to the plate to do what we said we would do when the bill was passed and the law was signed. But we also need to think it's not just the initial $2 million investment, but if and when claims ever are paid out of that fund, we need to make sure that there is also a mechanism in place to replace that money, because we don't need the fund to go down to zero and have to start all over again. So it's a matter of the initial investment and then being able to figure out and make certain that there are provisions for replenishing those dollars when they are taken out.
We appreciate them being here, and we really appreciate you coming out for our political forum today. Thank you so much, and go out and have a wonderful afternoon.